On today's episode, we endure the Australian Federal Police joking about how spoiling a movie is an arrestable offense. Hear a take about how if the government pays for reparations, it doesn't cost us anything. We talk about how liberty is only true freedom when it's constrained by democracy. We analyze the racism of a white person relating to a Latino's experience. And lastly, we talk about how Bitcoin only benefits white nationalists. This is Cringe Posts. Hello, friends. Welcome to this episode of the Cringe Post Podcast, the show where we're looking at those really bad takes you see in your feeds, but you don't have the time to engage with them. You don't want to get into a Twitter battle. We do that for you. We talk about these posts and what's wrong with them, the underlying assumptions, and have a good laugh while we're at it. If you enjoy this kind of thing, and if you've been listening to our show and you haven't been engaging, we would encourage you to do so. Click subscribe, follow us, comment, all that good stuff. It helps us grow, and we would love to see that in the new year. So before we move on to start tackling some of these cringy posts in our feeds from other people, we always like to start by criticizing our own bad posts, because we all have cringy bad posts. That's just the name of the game of being online and having grown up in the digital era. So we're going to start with a bad post from our co-host Britt. And this one reads, rain plus studying plus a little Skyrim equals a happy introverted heart. The first thing I just want to say is I like if you're not seeing the visual on our YouTube or Odyssey channels, rain, studying, a little, none of those are capitalized, but introverted was capitalized. And I almost feel like that gives away a little where you're going with this cringe post here.
Yeah. So one of the things I love, and I also appreciate, for those of you that are watching, you can see that Donald Kimball liked this status update. This is back in 2014. I think sophomore year, right? Freshman or sophomore year. I was thinking about this the other day about when people, because I am introverted, but like how people that self-describe themselves as introverted post about being introverted to their thousands of friends, publicly, and just kind of that weird, like, it's like, I need attention about how introverted I am. And like you were saying, the capitalized introverted, like, I'm really defining myself, as this introspective, thoughtful person. Obviously, I mean, you and I guess, posted a lot about Skyrim and stuff.
It was a big cultural deal at the time. Okay,
it was. Yeah, it was. What a great game. It still holds up. To however many years, 10 years, 11 years after the fact. But whenever I look back on these posts, like, I was one of those introverted people that needed to broadcast to the world that I was introverted, because that for some reason made me special. Not that 50% of the population is probably introverted, right? Like, I occupy a majority of, or at least half and half. So, or whatever the blend is.
It's funny because I think there's this stereotype and stigma of introverted people sort of scoffing at the antics of extroverted people doing things in public for attention, and in this way, you're doing the exact same thing. You're sending your little virtue signal, but it's in a way that's acceptable for an introvert to do it. So it's just kind of funny because you're like, oh, look at those extroverted people, making some debacle in public at the, our good friend Nico putting on a show in the cafeteria for attention to get laughs. Like, wow, I
Which
can't
usually is
believe
pretty
he needs
funny
to do that. Oh, he's hilarious, right? But the introverted snobbery of someone else, like, being like, wow, and then having to post, I like rain, I'm quirky. It's funny though, because I did the same. I'm also fairly introverted, and I remember growing up and thinking about things like seasons and weather and being like, you know what? Summer is overrated. I like winter the best. And now, and when I've grown up, I'm just like, no, that's a really stupid take, Donald. You live in Washington State. Like, the summer's fantastic. It gets warm. The days are long. It's awesome. And then I think what really was the final nail in the coffin was when I realized I actually do have some level of seasonal affectation disorder, where when it's sunny, I generally get happier for no measurable, discernible reason. other than just getting a good amount of vitamin D. And so it was just kind of funny because I'm like, okay, I was just being, I was just trying to be that snob who's like, I'm introverted. I like winter because I'm brooding and interesting, which is so stupid. So
Yes. Yeah. I'll get to my last point on this, but over the holidays, my mom has this pretty cool like service that she works for, and they basically, you can send in like your old like video cassettes or whatever, and they'll put it into a digital format, and you can like stream it on your laptop and stuff. So anyways, we were watching through these videos, and obviously the ones that as a little kid, I'm pretty cute and all that. But once it hits like, I'm like about 12 or 13, and I'm like watching myself, and maybe we'll have to put one of these up sometime. I was just like, dude, like I am so cringe and like too cool for school. And like, and it's just like, there's just something about, I think as people mature, like you don't need to differentiate yourself as much, right? But like as you're like growing up, whether you're 13 or I guess where I'm here when I'm 19 or whatever it is, like it's like, oh, I got to be different than everyone. Like I love the rain and studying and Skyrim, which everyone else loves too. So that makes me introverted.
I think it's funny though, because I think when right around that age, it's when you start losing your sort of childhood eagerness and general optimism and excitement that many kids have, and it becomes, I think it can branch off into different things. You can act really cool. You can act out in sort of your, I'm not going to cooperate. I think I was more of the actually and get into really argumentative kind of stuff. So I didn't think I was really cool, but I thought I was really smart, and I wanted to prove that to people in certain ways. So you all take these different bends, and then you kind of have to come back and humble yourself because, young enough, you're eager and you're like spouting some fact, and you're like, oh, that was really cute, but keeps going and it's not so great.
Yes.
So.
Yep.
Okie dokie. Well, we'll start now with our first cringe post. And this one comes from a verified Facebook user, which is the Australian Federal Police. And they post, things that aren't a crime, but probably should be. Publishing spoilers about Spider-Man No Way Home. So this was taken right after the opening weekend of Spider-Man No Way Home, which, if you're, again, watching this in 50 years for some reason, a very big cultural deal and one of the biggest movie releases in modern history. I and like two of my friends are the only humans I know on the planet who did not like this movie. That has nothing to do with this post. And Britt has not currently seen it, so I'm not going to talk about spoilers. The content of the movie has nothing to do with it. What I hate are three things off the bat. One, the Australian Federal Police posting about anything, because Australia is like, that is a hellscape right now. They just revoked the visa of the tennis player who was going to go compete to defend his championship title. He got a medical exemption to participate, not being vaccinated in this. So he got an exemption from the tournament, and then Australia was like, okay, well, we're just going to revoke your visa. You have to go home now. And there's lawyers that are going to try to sue this. But it's like Australia is locking down to stupid degrees. They were obviously assaulting their own people trying to break out for like just leaving their homes just to go outside. I don't want the Australian Federal Police being tongue-in-cheek about anything. Second, and kind of similar to that, which is generally speaking, law enforcement or government agencies posting these cutesy little things on social media. I really, really hate it because they're, in many ways, it's similar to when corporate brands post on like Twitter and Facebook and they try to get little personalities and stuff. There have been a few exceptions where I think it's funny, but most of the time it just looks really gimmicky and cheap. And I think it's even more insidious with government agencies that are literally responsible for the deaths of innocent people in many cases. Shout outs to Spike Cohen for always calling out these stupid cutesy posts that government agencies do. He's really good about keeping them accountable and mocking them to their face. And then third, whenever you say this should be a crime, I'm always going to cringe because of the implication that when you say this should be a crime, you are saying that whatever thing that you have said needs to be enforced with violence. And that always, always will be cringy to me.
Yeah. So when I was going through these slides beforehand, I didn't read who this was from, like at first. So I just read it. I said, oh, well, okay. Yeah, that's a little cringy. And then I read the Australian Federal Police, and I was like, oh, like this is important because they shouldn't joke about that, because that very well might come to fruition, like with how insane it is down there, where it's like, hey, I'm sure you've seen this video, but they stopped the guy, with the coffee, and they're like, we need to check to make sure there's liquid in your cup because you're drinking without a mask on.
Yeah.
If they're willing to do that, I am sure they're willing to tase you over, spoiling No Way Home. And that's what's, it's like, man, I guess 5 hours ago or whatever it was on that. So I'm assuming that was probably on what day it was. It was the 19th, right? That it came out?
It was somewhere along there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was the exact day or not. But.
So, this is just like, it would be like the, it'd be like the Empire after blowing up Alderaan, in Star Wars, be like, don't spoil this, the new Max Rebo band, single, or else we might blow you up like Alderaan. And people are like, ha ha ha, okay. Like, I wonder, man, I wish I could go back and find this. I might have to go look for it, because I would love to see what the comments are on it, because I'm sure the Australian populace is just like in disbelief, at least the folks that have been victimized by these people. And it's the federal police too, like you see a lot of like local police departments post stupid things like this, but this is like the federal, and I'm assuming by federal, they mean the entire nation state of Australia, like the police force for that.
As far as I'm aware. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so cringy.
Yeah. I mean, there's just a level of sort of like, aren't we relatable? That's cringy, just sort of in a cultural sphere. It's kind of like seeing your parents try to catch on to trends, where it's like, I appreciate you're trying, but it is really cringy that you're trying to use this lingo if they're trying to do it unironically, not to make you laugh. But this isn't like that, in the sense that when it's your parent, you're like, okay, they're harmless, they have good intent, they're just trying to be, trying to catch on or whatever. This is the police. This is just gross. This is just like the violent enforcement mechanism of the state, being, aren't we #relatable? We care about Spider-Man too.
Yeah, and they've got to look at it from the lens of like, it should be a crime, like you were talking about brands, like Wendy's has some really mean tweets, and they're pretty funny sometimes, how they mean tweet, but they're not like trying to like, I don't know, it's like I don't know how to relate it to Wendy's, but it's like the Australian Federal Police, it's like they couldn't even make a joke without like relating it back to how their primary function is to arrest people. And that's exactly terrible.
I think what makes Wendy's so absurd is the juxtaposition of Wendy's, a fast food restaurant chain, saying these like incredibly sick burns on a competitor or something like that, where it's like, the obviously Wendy's itself, its whole image is supposed to be this welcoming, friendly environment. It's a place where you get food, and the idea of it, lashing out any kind of like insult or diss against a competitor, it's a complete juxtaposition, right? Like, thing over here that's supposed to be sort of welcoming and like let your family come and eat cheap food, dishing out really mean insult to competitor. It's not a natural pairing. Whereas the Australian Federal Police saying that like probably should be a crime to do this thing. It's like, that's pretty like, it would be like if Wendy said something along the lines of, if you're mean to one of our registers, we'll, spit in your food. Or like Burger King tweeting, if you spoil Spider-Man No Way Home, we will step in your lettuce, with the infamous Burger King foot lettuce meme of the guy, standing in the lettuce or whatever. So it's like, something that hits too close to home, where it's actual realistic expectation, that you need to distance. And so that's why this is so tasteless. Okie dokie. Unless you have anything else, we will move to our next post. Okay. This one's from Twitter, and it reads, people always say, why do I have to pay for reparations? You're not paying. The government is paying. This one seems like it's kind of simple to me. If the government's paying for something, who ends up actually paying for that thing, right? And let's be honest. A lot of the reparation talk in terms of actual policies that have been promoted are individuals paying, not government payments. I think about South Africa and the taking land from white people, the white farmers, and just having the government forcibly transferring that to black people because of apartheid. And So when you talk about reparations in the abstract, maybe you could say, well, we'll just make government pay, which obviously is kind of silly. But in actual practice, the most realistic legislation of things going through actually do target individuals, not government payments. Now, of course, even if the government pays, that does mean everyone pays for it, right? But still, the realistic examples to me are all targeting individuals, not through government reimbursements.
Yeah, this one reminded me of one of our top tens, which was Robert Reich saying, if there's anything we've learned, the government can stop the pandemic and they can pay everyone, and we can afford to pay it. And it's all right, these people's concept of like money, and obviously I'm going for the low hanging fruit here, but it's like, the government doesn't produce anything, right? Like, people don't get that. It's the weirdest thing. It's like they don't produce any sort of value. They forcibly take that value from you, the normal taxpayer or business that generates value. They take anywhere, between 10 to 30, 40, 50, 60% of what it is, and then they choose where they're going to allocate it, right? And so regardless, even if let's say the government was going to whatever, maybe they sold bonds or something like that to raise for reparations. The administrative state, right, that's going to facilitate these reparations is paid for by you, right? And that's why, with like Social Security, 70% of the money that is given out is actually used for administrative purposes, right? The whole budget for it. So that it's always funny when they think of like, for some reason, the worst parts of government are like, they can kind of analogize it to like a business, like, oh, the government has money to pay for things, but they can't understand that's like, oh, well, the government's not even run like a business, right? Like if you do a bad job as a government, like you get more money. That's what's so crazy about it. It's like selective, not selective memory, but just selective thinking, I guess, on the whole process of how these things work.
And to your point, in case, some skeptics listening to us and saying, oh, the government does a worse job and they get more money. What are you talking about? Well, let's look at like actual examples, right? So a great example is with the transportation package that has been passed. This is not the Build Back Better thing, but the like transportation funding things that the federal government gave to all of the states for transit spending like that, right? The problem is that in Washington State during COVID and leading up to COVID, it was a trend, but it drastically decreased in COVID because of obvious reasons. But the transit agencies and public transit ridership decreased heavily. And again, this was a trend before COVID. COVID happened, and obviously it dropped off a cliff. The problem, and the thing is, as far as the costs are concerned, there are actual viable plans to save money through implementation of other plans. I was just listening to a proposed plan by a researcher today, and ways to adopt new systems, new technology, and all this would be saving costs. But there's no incentive for them to make the change because, one, as humans, our nature is to not want to change unless we have to, right? Because starting something in motion rather than keeping something in motion is a lot harder. So you have a natural resistance to change in a system like that. But most importantly, too, you're not incentivized because even though you are losing ridership, you are losing your customers, essentially, you're getting federal money dumped through this external source to just spend more. So rather than like trying to think of cost saving measures to make your system better and more efficient, you just get more money to dump into an inefficient system and keep people on staff and payroll. So that's a great example of just one of these cases where, if this was a private business, you lose your customer base, you lose money, and you have to figure out a way to make your business meet the needs of the people better or save money and do the same thing you're doing, but more effectively. With government, that's literally the opposite because the federal government just infuses cash into state governments or it prints money if it needs it at the federal level. And so exactly. So you try to raise or create money as the government to pay for reparations, and what you're doing usually involves either inflating the currency, which devalues everyone's savings in the nation, or it involves some kind of service that doesn't actually make back any kind of money. So when people say, "Why do I have to pay for reparations?" they're pretty apropos. It does not make sense to pay for it because you can't just generate something from nothing. in the way that these people do. Obviously, you can create value, but like there's work and there's effort put into that. So when you say you're going to pay for reparations, that effort and that value has to come from somewhere, and the government does not create it. So it takes it from your creation, from the excess, the profits of what you have made that you should keep.
Yeah, and I guess if I was to steelman this person's argument, because I think this is the most compelling part about when people like trying to advocate for things like single payer healthcare or anything like that. It's like, well, it's not, it's already your money. You're paying it to the government, so why not use it on things that we all agree we'd all benefit from, right? And that, I guess that's how you could steelman. It's like, well, yeah, the government's paying. It's money that you, for whatever social contract or whatever argument they have, like you have to pay it. And like we're all agreeing that we should, distribute this money to, repay for different things. And then, okay, if you steelman, then you can kind of get into the actual argument of like, should reparations be paid? And then it's the easy argument of like, well, like how do you determine who gets paid what reparations? Is it someone that was here in the 1800s and can trace their lineage back then? Is it my grandmother who immigrated over here in the 1930s? She's white, but she didn't own any slaves. In fact, she has a history of slavery in Europe, to other people, so that's the whole thing about reparations. It's like, okay, then on top of it, right, are we going to have the government who can't even, provide an adequate, Department of Licensing service to us? Like, I hate going to the DOL. Are they going to be the ones to determine how this is all allocated? And we're going to guarantee that it's going to be fair. It's like, no. So that's where it falls short. I know we always try and steelman stuff, and that's kind of where I was thinking maybe this person might be coming from, but it's absurd on all levels, regardless of whether you straw man it or steelman it.
Completely agree. Okie dokie, we are going to move to this next one, and this is an interaction on Facebook. And so I don't even remember the original post, but I thought that this comment was particularly funny. So a person is commenting progressives saying that, quote, liberty is a threat to us. And then he posts the clip from That Mitchell and Webb Look, where the the Nazi agent is asking, are we the baddies? Which is a hilarious skit if you haven't seen, where these Nazi guys are talking, and they may not be Nazis. They may be World War I. I can't even remember, but they're like talking back and forth. It's like, are we the baddies? We've got skulls on our caps. Like, why do we have skulls? It's a really funny quote or skit. But anyway, point is, so he posts this, progressive saying liberty is a threat to us. Are we the baddies? And the page that is made the original post replied, which it's a public page, so I'll go ahead and out them. They are called the Progressive State Project, and they comment, quote, liberty, unquote, that rejects democracy is the problem. Liberty properly constrained by democracy through duly elected leaders is true freedom. That's like a brain twister right there. So, okay, hold on. So liberty properly constrained by democracy through duly elected leaders is freedom. You're like, what? This cat chasing its or dog chasing its own tail kind of thing, where it's saying, no. Real liberty is when you're forced to comply with the majority, and then the leaders that you're bound to actually provide you with freedom there. Then when they tell you what you can do, that's true freedom. That's not how liberty, and at least in any political sense of the word, works.
It's very 1984-esque, which is, the freedom is slavery line in there that they've got. And this obsession with democracy, I heard Dave Smith today on his podcast talk about how he's like, if democracy is 51% determining what's right for the other 49% or whatever, right? And he set up this example where he's like, hey, like if you took away that 51%, you just said, hey, you've got 49% of people living under laws that they don't want to live under. Like we would call that, criminal, a dictatorship, tyranny, unjust, North Korea, whatever you want to call it. And we'd properly recognize it for what it is as something that's awful and bad. So what makes the difference when, 51% of people can actually, implement that under 49%? And then he went on to say, and I agree with him, he's like, in the United States, it's not even, you're lucky if you are the, like, let's just say the federal election, like the presidential election. Like, if you get 25% of the population to vote for you, like, that's a landslide election, right? Like, that's huge. So really what it is you got 25% of the populace dictating to, however many have the opposite view, 49% of the country, how they're going to live, which is wild. And I don't think any of us would think that's good. But because of, the public school system, and, you and I grew up as homeschoolers, right? So we didn't have the indoctrination of like, ooh, democracy is the end all be all. As I always thought, like, it's funny in Revenge of the Sith, when they're like hyping up democracy and like my loyalty is to democracy, to the republic.
Yeah.
I always thought that was really funny. I'm like, oh, that Obi-Wan, that's not a very good look for you.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of tyranny. But like, because so many people have been indoctrinated, they're like, democracy is like this pillar that is unquestionable. You can't question it. It's the sacred cow of the American education system, and to question it is heresy.
To your Obi-Wan point, to me, he always just seemed like that really misguided person who's like, oh, mandates are fine when they're used in the right ways, but my loyalty is through implementing mandates through a legislative body. And you're like, oh, okay, well, whatever. It's like, to be fair, your loyalty then was to Palpatine, Obi-Wan, because he was in fact charge of the Republic and he did guide all the votes and stuff. So, hey, the democracy voted the way that he wanted to give them, giving him all the powers was a democratically elected decision. He didn't seize power through violence, right? Which is kind of just a funny thing for him to still say my loyalties to democracy, because democracy is literally what turned it into an empire instead of to keep going on the Star Wars thing, which I apologize if you're not a Star Wars fan. My wife doesn't watch Star Wars, so I have to speak in layman's terms sometimes. But it is just kind of, that fictional example really does demonstrate the sort of insane logic and inherently self-defeating aspect of democracy, which is to say, if democracy were to vote itself out, if you like democracy, you have to respect that. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, if 51% of people decide that we don't like democracy anymore and we're going to become a tyranny, if you support democracy because you're voting against it, because you want a democratically decided thing, you have to admit that the democratically elected decision, the decided decision, is the correct one, which was to abolish democracy, which is just a complete absurdity on its face. Obviously, democracy can be used in a good way, but as a system, it just doesn't really hold up to any kind of an ethical value in and of itself, and it just becomes another tool for people to inflict force on others if they want them to. So, I mean, it's kind of like in the same way where, I don't know, we could say things like, state-run healthcare, hypothetically, theoretically, could provide services to the maximum amount of people at the cheapest cost if everything was run right and, government bureaucrats were really incentivized to work hard, work longer hours, and all these things. That's just not how it plays out in practice when the incentives aren't there for that to exist. That's why you and I would purport capitalism, not because capitalism is an inherently, ethical thing where everyone magically becomes good, but because it creates the incentives that play on everyone's, selfish interests to make a better society. And so when you look at, selfish interests and what you're incentivized to do in a democracy, the selfish interests are always to use the majority's power against the minority. So there's no inherently ethical value to democracy, other than it hypothetically could be used in a good way if everyone was perfectly moral. And at that point, you wouldn't need a democracy because there wouldn't really be ethical disagreements.
This is a really interesting example of because the left and the right are both statists, right? But the right has some adherence to a moral standard, whereas the left has tried to totally get rid of it, right? They're like, there are no standards, and Nietzsche talks about that, where he's like, hey, they're going to get rid of these things, they're going to have to make their own standards, and democracy is almost like its own moral pillar, like I said earlier, that they have to stand on. And so when they encounter things, because you see liberty, right, and you have they are correct in saying that a good person or a good society will constrain their liberty in some form or fashion, right? Because everyone doing whatever they want at any point is not going to be a good or healthy society. But the way that it must be constrained is through things like virtue, right? Through social fabric, through people having personal responsibility and stuff like that. But because the left rejects those values, they're forced to look for, a way to constrain that liberty through force, right? And the way that they see it is like, well, through democracy, and democracy is good because it constrains liberty. Because they're not wrong in that, everyone needs to have control over themselves at some point, right? Like liberty does need to be constrained. Like if I want to have a healthy, successful marriage, like I need to constrain myself from looking at other women, or I need to constrain myself from, not fulfilling my husbandly duties, right, at home, or doing things like that. And so does my wife. But these people, at every turn and point, it reminds me of, we don't have it on here, but Ethan Klein, like the YouTuber, making fun of Joe Rogan. He's like, oh, Joe Rogan's not healthy. He eats elk meat and all this stuff. It's like, you look at Joe Rogan, who's someone who has discovered freedom through discipline, right? Through personal responsibility, through seeking the truth, and through, always exercising and taking care of himself. And then you've got Ethan Klein, who's overweight and not healthy and all these different things, and like seeks to have virtue and seeks to have freedom through constraining other people, right? And I think this is a great illustration of the difference between the left and the right, in that both are statists, right? And we abhor statism in both ways. And I think that on the right, at least, it's like, hey, people, instead of the state forcing down morals and all those things, theocracy, you need to have churches and people and advocating for that stuff. But the left just wants to do it through brute force, and this is a clear example of them using democracy as a substitute for personal responsibility and virtue.
Your entire point, it makes me think of the Edmund Burke quote: "The men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains on their own appetites." And then I think it ends off with like, their passions forge their fetters. And it's this exact idea that, ironically, like you were saying, the idea that unconstrained liberty, you kind of like this progressive state project comments, it can be a problem. But the idea that the duly elected leaders out of democracy are the ones to put those chains on is ridiculous. It's unsustainable, and it's absurd to claim that they would know. So yeah, I think that, once you come up with sort of a virtue ethic, it becomes a lot clearer that without initiating force, you need to put these kinds of restraints on yourself. And uninitiated violence is unethical, and that means that I have to do my best to teach my kids, to teach my family, to try to convince my community, my neighbors, my friends that, voluntary action and nonviolence is the right, course of action. Like, hey, someone wants what you have. You don't just get to run over and take that thing because you're stronger, right? You have to have that self-restraint. But again, to try to put it through the lens of the duly elected leaders, as that's what's going to somehow make this moral, that comes dangerously close to the idea of being able, democracy, to sort of crystal ball the benevolent dictator, which I don't think has ever really worked out, to be honest. And besides, I like that it says duly elected, because then it's just an easy cop-out. Well, Trump obviously had Russia, so he wasn't a duly elected leader. Well, obviously Joe Biden had, rigged the election and stole it from Trump, so he's not a duly elected. You just go into he said, she said, in terms of who isn't or isn't democratically elected. And so you kind of get a get out of jail free card if someone you don't like is telling you to do something you don't want to do. That's okay, good. We will move on to our next post here. This one comes from Twitter, and it reads, "I hope to see more hashtag Latina rep, Latine rep, I suppose. Excuse me. So I hope to see more Latine rep in the publishing industry as well. Nothing breaks my heart more than reading a book I identify with so much and seeing that the cover artist once again is another white person getting the paid opportunity to depict us. We need to be lifted too." I think he meant Latina or Latino, because he had a lot of typos in this. I love the fact that this person specifies, I identified with this so much, and then I'm just crushed when I find out it was a white person who made it. It's like if you identified with the author, with a character, the author's doing a good job. This makes me think of our Boondocks episode a little bit, and our Boondocks comment where it's a really backwards, old-fashioned, and kind of racist idea that only you can sympathize or feel with the experience of another race. That's very weird to me because these people keep talking about how you can't otherize people. And yet if you try to have any sort of sympathy or try to relate with empathy or feel these things with another race, you're instantly called, demonized, racist, or whatever. And so it's just really funny that this person says and admits, like, oh, I identified with this character, and then I found out that the author was white, and I just, it crushed me. It's like, well, no, you should be happy that, one, you found a character you could connect with and you related to, and two, that someone of a different race was able to make that kind of a meaningful character that understood your perspective so well that you related to. Wouldn't you be celebrating the fact that it wasn't a Latino author or a Latina author? Or because like you would think that you would want there to be more people who understand your perspective and can articulate it well. In the same way that I'm happy if a socialist who I disagree with can articulate my position as well as me, because that means that we can argue in good faith and they're not gonna straw man my arguments.
Yeah, it reminded me of, so I'm Filipino and I grew up with a lot of really good teriyaki in my family. Like, my dad was fantastic at making good chicken teriyaki, and then he knew all the good spots like in my hometown and stuff. And when I went to college, there was this really solid spot, and it was really good. I didn't care who made it, but it was just like, this is like authentic, great teriyaki. And I remember having a conversation with this gal at school. We were talking about the best teriyaki places, and she liked this one place down the road, and I said, I like this other place. And she's like, oh, like that's not authentic. Like the people that make it, they're like a Mexican family owns and operates it, which is true. And I was like, yeah, but like I think it's awesome, and it tastes just like how my dad makes it, who's a legit Asian. I don't really care. At the end of the day, it's like what makes something authentic? Ethnic food in one way or the other. Is it the color of the person making it, or is it the methods by which they make it, right? And I caught on the same thing too when I saw this post, because it's like, it'd be one thing if this person said, hey, I hope to see more Latino rep in the publishing industry because I read this book and it got this and this wrong about this culture, right? And I think that you could debate one way or the other, but like I think that it would probably be solved if we had more people that actually grew up in Latino culture or whatever. But they totally undermine their point because they're like, oh no, I identified with it, like it was authentic, it was real, but it was a white person that did it. So it's just like, you're right. That's such a racist thing to say. It's not judging. It is literally judging the content based on the person's skin color, not based on whether the content's actually good.
Think about how absurd it would be for an American to say, oh my gosh, I just resonated with the band Phoenix. I love their music. It moves me so much. And then I was crushed to find out they're a French band and they just learned English and they sing in English because they learned it and it's their second language. And you're paying French people to promote white kind of music. That's devastating. White people need to get paid the same to sing English songs. Like, what a stupid take that would be, right? And I think, and maybe I'm mistaken, I actually don't know, but I tend to think that a lot of people in countries and cultures actually generally tend to appreciate when like a band will sing in their language. I think of like Calexico, which is a band in sort of Southern California, and they do a lot of interesting like California, kind of alt rock, West Coast surfer vibes mixed with Mexican music. And it's a really cool fusion and they sing in Spanish and in English. And it's awesome. And I appreciate it. And I would assume that someone from Mexico would probably find it, enjoyable as well. And kind of a cool, fusion way. And so I don't know. I just see all these people dividing and nitpicking who's able to create what and where. And I'm like, I don't know, man. If it tastes good to me, then it tastes good. And if it's authentic, then it's authentic. And it doesn't matter who makes what. I don't care if it's been passed down to a white person, a black person, or an Asian person, if you can serve me delicious food that tastes, like its original cuisine, that's great to me.
Yeah.
Or write a book that articulates the experience of X, Y, or Z people accurately, then that's great for me. And it's really funny because, there were all these cries for representation. Why don't we have a Latino or Latina princess, Disney princess kind of stuff? Why don't we have a X superhero, whatever it is. And then, once you get that, you just push a little bit more. Well, that's not fair because that movie was the screenplay was written by a white person. It's like, I thought you wanted the representation. Why does the person behind it matter so much? And I would be even less sort of annoyed by this post if it was a call for, I really want more Latino writers to be successful. I still think it's one of those things where it's like, if you're a good writer and you should be promoted. But I can understand to wanting to promote genuine, authentic experiences. But at the point where you're saying this white person got the authentic experience, then I don't know. I don't see why you're mad that they got paid.
That's amazing. That means someone was interested and loved the culture so much that they were willing to totally throw themselves into it enough that they could replicate it to the point that you couldn't even tell the difference, right? That takes attention to detail. And I don't know all the intricacies of what this is, but it was obviously enough to fool this person, right? And it's not even fooling. It's just like, I would be flattered, right? If someone did something, if I am I play in a band, right? Like if someone covered a song that we did and they did it so well and they got all the little intricacies, I don't care if they look the same as me or if they have this name Brit or whatever, or if they're 6'1" and half Filipino, half Swedish. It's like, wow, like they paid attention and they did something cool. Like that's important to me and that's amazing. And that's like you were saying, this is just plain, this is racism. Like this person is racist and it's an ugly thing as well as cringe.
The last thing I will say is, I don't doubt that there are many times when, a white person or anyone of any color, represents a different culture inaccurately in media.
Sure.
And the ones that come to mind maybe aren't the most popular for people like this to tout, which is whenever you see Hispanic or Latina or Latino representation, I think of I can't remember if it was Luca or Encanto, one of the new Disney ones. I haven't seen them either, but it's all about, these magic and sort of this mystical magic. And the reason why is because I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think like a majority of these kinds of populations tend to be Roman Catholic, and they don't want to draw that into the culture, even though that's a huge part of their culture. They don't want to depict, Catholicism because, well, that's a religion and that, that's sketchy. It's not part of their culture. That's a religion. It's like, no. That religion is a major part of their culture. So they go to general spiritual mysticism and magic and stuff. And I saw that pointed out and I was like, that is a really apt, interesting point that someone made there. So it happens, but not always in the way that people like this want it to. So. Okay, and we're going to have our final post for the episode. And this one, I was sad I didn't find this one. I don't think it was written by the time we had Britt's Bitcoin take, but this would have gone along with it pretty well. So, Britt, as a now apologist for Bitcoin, I think you're probably a little nervous, a little worried here. This one is actually an article written by on The Hill, and it is the headline is Bitcoin Surge, a boon for white nationalists study. And then the opening sentence, the increase in Bitcoin's value over the last few years has made several prominent white nationalists rich, according to a Southern Poverty Law Center study. They're like, okay, this gave me all the information I needed. If it's Southern Poverty Law Center, it's probably sketchy to begin with, but two, that they're going to interpret whatever data they get in the stupidest way possible. The Southern Poverty Law Center is going to label anyone to the right of Bernie Sanders as a white nationalist hate speech provocateur. I don't know. But I love the line say the increase in Bitcoin's value has made several prominent white nationalists rich. I'm like, okay, so should we also say when they were bragging about job numbers increasing after the COVID lockdowns in Joe Biden's administration, like Joe Biden's job surge, a boon for, racists in the South, a study. And it's like national unemployment dropped, and that included some racists. I mean, what a stupid way to interpret the data.
Well, I mean, this is just like we've had a lot of these takes on here, but like an obvious, like, oh, I don't like this, and I'm being told I need to write against Bitcoin, so racism and white nationalism, and oh, thank God, the Southern Poverty Law Center, list of domestic terrorists has these people on it. They basically have everyone on there, right? Like they've got freaking, what's nuts, man? The SPLC or whatever, they have Focus on the Family on their list of hate groups or whatever. And it's like, man, if any of you guys, Focus on the Family is a Christian organization, but it's like they do values like, hey, like you probably shouldn't let your kid watch The Matrix if they're 4 years old, right? Like they've kind of got articles like that, on their website and things, like a very like milquetoast, like standard family values. So everyone makes the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of domestic hate groups. It's so cringy, man.
I was gonna say I don't know the entire list, but even just scrolling through their 2016 one, I'm not particularly familiar with some of these institutions. Maybe some of them are racist, but then you have some that are listed as like, I don't know, America Eagle Party. You're like, what is that? Like it's like this thing listed in one tiny town of Tennessee. I mean, it sounds like literally going, and they could list like Bob Greenwood, who lives in 313 apartment 4A in North Dakota. It's like, how small do you really care? Or it's like Conservative Citizens Foundation, Faith and Heritage. I don't know what these are, but like, I don't know. It seems like they probably aren't white nationalist groups, hate groups or whatever. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know. It made me laugh because like, of course, White Lives Matter is also on their list, of course. Yeah. But I don't know. There's just always going to be a small group you can pick on and just call them a hate group because they don't like things you like, or vice versa.
Yeah, they're just a repository for people to be like, and this designated hate group, and then they have a little reference, and it's like, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, it's like basically it's just a vector for them to choose whoever they want to like designate as a hate group and like have the resources to back it up. I've had many, we live here in Seattle. Anytime I talk about anything like Focus on the Family or maybe Krista or any of these different types of good organizations that do good things, people will say, oh, well, they're designated as a hate group. And I go, well, who did that? It's like, well, the Southern Poverty Law Center. Most of these people don't even know like who they are, what they do.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's exactly it. It makes me think of on Facebook, when they do the little fact checks, for, fact check, this has been proven wrong. Well, the way that works is you can pretty much just sign up to be a fact checker on Facebook. You have to usually have some kind of credential, but you can literally just sign up to designate yourself as a fact checker. And then and this happened to one of my coworkers where his study was deemed false by a fact checker. And you open the little fact checking link that Facebook provides, and they couldn't actually say that any of the data in his study was false. They said, we just think he should have emphasized X data over Y data. So they didn't like his conclusion because he emphasized something over the other, but none of it was false. It was just a different interpretation of data, but it got flagged as false. And I feel like that's exactly what this group does, as labeling a hate groups is. You're just like, oh, this one doesn't support LGBT, therefore it is a hate group, regardless of the actual content of their stuff.
Charity Watchdog, like my band's worked with a lot of different charities and nonprofits in the past, and we usually use Charity Watchdog to like kind of sort out who we want to work with or who we don't want to work with. And from what I've seen, they're pretty good. But guess what the Southern Poverty Law Center's charity watch grade is? It's an F.
Oh, no way.
I have never seen an F. I'm serious. I've searched through probably hundreds of these things, and I've never seen an F. The worst I've seen is a C. And I'm trying to look at why they gave them an F, but they gave them an F in 2019. And I think it probably has something to do with like 64% of their or not 64, 30, a pretty high percentage of their budget goes towards overhead, and then a lot of it goes to like fundraising and stuff like that, which makes sense, right? Like this whole thing, like I was saying, the whole purpose of this organization is to just put the official stamp on you're a hateful person, whoever they view, deem it to be. So,
yeah. Well, and then of course, so you get this kind of goofy, absurd labeling from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and then you write an article in the Hill about how the rise in Bitcoin benefited some people who happen to be white nationalists. It's like, yeah, Bitcoin's kind of owned by a lot of people. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's kind of a popular thing. If anything has ever been concurrently the number one search term in all 50 states at the same time in any given year, I would say it's a little popular. Probably a lot of people own it. You're bound to get a few white nationalists when increasing in value when Bitcoin goes up. That's not news. That's not news. That's stupid.
Yeah, you could almost, you could do something like the rise in Bitcoin has made pedophiles richer. Yeah. And like, this person, because you can look them up, right? Like this person owns this much Bitcoin, and this pedophile is, that. Therefore, we need to get rid of Bitcoin. That's how absurd this is.
Well, and let's flip the script a little bit, right? Let's talk about like the inflation, right? This inflation has devalued the currency of the heroes of the pandemic, the first response workers. You could write any kind of a stupid article talking about how inflation has hurt the most vulnerable, and it has, and that's why the difference is that when inflation hurts people, in these subgroups, it's because by its very nature, it hurts the people who are the most worse off for it, right? Like the poorest in society, versus Bitcoin, which literally benefits anyone who happened to own it. And in fact, a lot of people who I know who owned it were not in the top echelons of society, right?
Yes.
It was very specifically like young college students or people who had just heard of it early, and they rose with it. But it's like you can just literally take any kind of sort of global phenomenon and then just apply it to a subsect of that group and then claim that the entire thing is pointed against them. And that's just stupid. Like, for instance, I don't think inflation is meant to hurt the very poorest in society. I think it's meant to benefit the power brokers in DC. Its effect is that it ends up hurting the poorest in society. But moreover, it just benefits the corporate people who are doing it, the corporate elites, the government, all of those, that sort of corruption ring up there. That's what it's for. So if I were to sort of write this article like saying, this study finds that it only hurts poor people, I would be remiss to say why, to leave out the important fact of the reason they do this is to manipulate currencies because they can afford it. If I were just to write it from the angle of they specifically did this because they want to hurt widows, that would be an absurd claim for me to make, right? To be like, oh, this really hurt widows because on average, widows are not as well off as the Federal Reserve employees or something stupid like that. So you can take any subsective group, claim it's a targeted harassment at them, and no matter what, there's some truth to the claim, but you don't get to write a headline story about it to make it sound as though Bitcoin itself is a white nationalist boon.
Yeah, like you're saying, it's factually true, but it kind of is irrelevant. It doesn't really matter, and it doesn't actually tell a story other than get some clickbait. That's it. I don't have any more on this one.
Nope, I think we're good. So we will wrap up this episode, first episode of 2022. Thanks for sticking with us. We're excited to go into the new year with all these cringe takes, and you know what? It's an election year, so I'm sure we're gonna get to see a lot of cringe. There's a lot bound to happen. I'm sure we'll probably see some similar themes. In fact, I think we've had some election takes on here, and people tend to be broken records when it comes to people winning elections they don't like. So, looking forward to that later this year. But again, if you are enjoying your time with us, we really would appreciate a subscribe, a like, a comment, all that. Follow us on our socials, Cringe Posts Pod or cringeposts.com. And we will see you on the next episode. Take care.